Fair districts for New Mexico. Getting redistricting right in 2021. Two New Mexico state senators talk about New Mexico redistricting. First, a little background. The New Mexico Constitution assigns the responsibility for redistricting congressional districts, New Mexico Senate and House District, the Public Regulation Commission, and the Public Education Commission to the legislature. This happens every 10 years. A growing number of states have reformed their redistricting process to make it fair and transparent. New Mexico has not. The 2001 and 2011 redistricting cycles ended up in the courts, costing taxpayers an additional $7 million in legal fees. In New Mexico, legislators get to choose their constituents, instead of constituents choosing their legislators. Let's hear what two New Mexico state senators have to say about past redistricting and how we may get the 2021 redistricting cycle right.
We went through a very elaborate process of holding hearings. The committee was actually, I think, 38 or 40 member committee. And we went all over the state. Every corner of the state we had hearings. We had public input right and left. We had all sorts of possible scenarios drawn up. And then after that whole summer spent doing that and spending a great deal of money for legislators traveling around the state and visiting parts of the state they may never have seen previously, we came back to Santa Fe and sat down and threw all of that out and did our own maps. It became in large measure an incumbent protection process. I don't think in New Mexico it was as much partisan. There may be some, Mark might have a different view of it, but for the most part, it was how do we protect the current members from any potential threat of losing in a subsequent election. And so there are something like 15 communities in the state that were divided in the middle. Taos, for example, Alamogordo. There are all sorts of scenarios in which the community, which you would think would be held together as a contiguous whole with similar interests and similar concerns, was divided up. Now, I have to say that a lot of communities like that. They want that. Mm-hmm. It makes it twice as influential in the legislative process. If you have two senators representing a given community, Gallup, for example, two senators representing each senator is supposed to have 50,000 people living in their district. That's the target. If you have two senators representing the city of Gallup and then, radiating out into nearby areas, it gives the city of Gallup a lot of influence that otherwise it wouldn't have. So it's not that kind of incumbent protection didn't draw a lot of attention from the communities. They liked it. But it means, for example, and I clearly remember several instances in which incumbents said, oh, don't include those precincts in my district, even though it made more sense from a lot of reasons, because some of those precincts have living within them prospective potential opponents for me in the primary, and I just don't want to have to face them. You know, the way New Mexico is broken out, you've got Republican strengths in the Northwest, in some of the Albuquerque Heights, and in the Southeast. And it almost doesn't matter how you redistrict in those areas because you're going to have strong Republican representation in those areas. Where it becomes a little dicier is in the margins. And that's where all the battles seem to focus on. How do you make a district invulnerable to the potential that a Republican might, God forbid, be elected? That was the real process. And it was just kind of, this is harsh, probably unnecessarily harsh, but it felt like a sham process that we had gone through, going around the state, having all these hearings, and then just ignored all of that and said to each incumbent, well, how do you want to divide your district up? And then we tried to make it work as best as we could so that everybody had what they wanted. Guaranteed victory in the primary.
and everyone thinks that Santa Fe is so partisan, and it's not necessarily on a lot of issues. My first taste at the redistricting battles was in 2001. I served as chief of staff for the then lieutenant governor during that lawsuit. So I was on the sidelines and saw that process, and we were named, since he was president of the Senate, in the lawsuit, which basically meant we were able to hire a lawyer, one more lawyer in the very litigious process that went on that year. And so I knew that was not the right way to do redistricting. And what Jerry said was correct. And you'll notice that he didn't talk a lot, although he did talk some about the Republican-Democrat redistricting and incumbent protection process. A lot of what happens in redistricting, as Jerry mentioned, was about primaries. Since we don't have open primaries, and since we have a closed system in New Mexico, and because of redistricting also, most of the elections are won in the primaries. Jerry in his district has to more worry about his primary election. In my district, I have to worry about my primary election much more than I do my general election, and him also. And so what you see is an incumbent protection program to, like as Jerry said, cut out potential opponents in your primary. And also another incumbent is leadership. Those who would control the legislative process on both sides, Republican and Democrat, make sure redistricting is an opportunity to cull people out of their caucus who might be a threat to them, to make sure that they keep into the leadership position. And that happens a lot. And what Jerry mentioned earlier, on the Republican side, we have 2 senators from Alamogordo in the eastern New Mexico, which tends to be more Republican. But we don't have a single senator from Clovis. We don't have one from Carlsbad. We don't have one who actually lives in the city of Roswell. So you see how these things play out at the micro level when you start dealing with internal caucus leadership issues, and then that keeps moving on to leadership of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So a lot of people like to talk about this being Republican-Democrat, and I can tell you it's much more knife fight in the trenches when it gets down to the caucus level fighting that happens when you're trying to make sure your district is perfect for your election, and the horse trading and the fighting that happens at that level is much more intense a lot of times than it is between Republicans and Democrats.
What is the major issue around the redistricting process, and why is it requiring so many years of effort to try to get something done that should be basic to our democracy?
I think I can only talk about New Mexico, really, because I don't know about any other state and their experience with it. But I think in New Mexico, because we've held it so close to the vest, and we go behind closed doors to come up with these maps that satisfy us, and then we spring them on the public. It's like a red flag in front of a bull. Of course, you're going to have legal challenges. You've done something, and even if what the court ultimately approves is not significantly better than what we had come up with, it's just the way we went about doing it was like asking for trouble, asking for court action. Now, we've spent millions on these attorneys' legal fees when they sue us over a process that we could have avoided all of that if we had just been more open about it and done things more out in the open. I know I favor a commission. It needn't be a complicated thing. My own version of this, and you've heard this from me a couple of times, but if the courts are always going to be the ones to decide it, why don't we form a commission of 3 retired Supreme Court justices, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, and a third one that the 2 of them have to agree on. And then they go through the maps and consider. There are really only 2 considerations. One is each district has to be about the same size, and they have to be, fairly representative of a community of interest. And so if you can meet those 2 needs, I think the Supreme Court justices could come up with a plan, or 2 plans, or 3 plans, and then we still have under the Constitution the obligation of doing it. We meet and we vote on it, but it's all done out in the open in public. And there's not this sense that something has been pulled over our eyes by this process that just didn't smell right.
I completely agree. And I've actually been the sponsor twice of various redistricting reform measures. We've actually tried a commission in the past, and we had a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation introduced. And the reason it doesn't move forward, quite frankly, what I referred to earlier, is sheer political power. We had a bill that had Republican and Democrat sponsors, Senate and House sponsors, and when it was dropped, we actually filed it early in February or December for the session. When it was introduced, it actually received 3 committee hearings. Even though we filed it early, and never once out of those 3 referrals had a hearing, because quite frankly, leadership didn't want it. And that's what the power of the legislative process is. When you're in leadership and you control the next redistricting, and you can ensure that your party and those who support you in your caucus continue to be in power for the next 10 years, you have no desire to change the system. It's a system that you were created by, and you don't want to change it. Now you can give lip service to wanting to reform and change, but when it comes down to it, you don't want to change. So I tried that redistricting in a bipartisan, bicameral message. I've also introduced, working with the League of Women Voters, the Iowa model. Last session, since we couldn't do a constitutional amendment, since we're getting closer to the election, that again, we passed it for the first time. We passed it out with Jerry and I and some others supporting in the Senate rules. We got it passed out of a committee hearing for, I think, the first time in the history of the legislature, a committee passed a redistricting. Of course, it didn't come close to the floor and didn't come close to the final passage, but it was movement. But the answer to your question is it's sheer political power by the elites who control the legislative process, who don't want to give up that power. It's not a Republican-Democrat issue. It is those who control versus those who want reform. A lot of the bloodletting happens within the caucuses during the redistricting process. So there's always cross-party. There's always Senator Ortiz, Pino coming to Mark Moore's in the halls and say, hey, can you take this precinct from me and I'll give you this precinct? And that kind of backroom deals happen. Regardless of Republican versus Democrat. So that kind of stuff happens during redistricting, and it's Republican and Democrat and internal caucus. And so if you're districting, you're that one person that is supposed to be culled from the herd in your caucus, it encourages you to go to the other side and strike a deal. So yeah, that can happen, but in the real politics of the legislative process, it doesn't happen that way.
I think Mark's right that we certainly have no guarantee that this is going to be any smoother, and what we have absolutely no control over are the outside legal activists who will challenge whatever we come up with. The creation of a commission is no guarantee that you won't get sued, but what you hope is that it'll be so rational. It'll be so obviously based on something other than self-interest that the courts will just toss those suits instead of going on month after month of legal fees running up the tab. I think we paid something like 30 different attorneys last time, millions of dollars, each representing a slightly different angle on a slightly different redistricting plan. Because, we've been focusing on the Senate because we're both state senators, but we have to draw up the congressional districts. The House draws up the House. We have to do the public utility, or what is it, PRC, Public Regulatory Commission. And then even the little state education commission, they have to be redistricted too. So if we do it with total accountability and transparency, we really mitigate the possibility that we're going to spend millions on legal fees. And to me, that's the biggest argument for doing it right. That you can't stop somebody from filing suit, but if the suit clearly has no grounds, we shouldn't have to pay beaucoup bucks to lots and lots of lawyers to argue this in the courts. And to me, that's money that's just absolutely wasted. We could save that money and put it into so many better things.
The third aspect that is critical for redistricting is protecting minority voting rights. And in Mexico, that often is Native American because of past discriminations in drawing districts in previous redistricting processes. So that's the third very critical element. Jerry mentioned two of them, and the third is the
Minority
protecting Native American voting rights. And what happens, Jerry, you'll remember last legislative redistricting plan, what was the number one priority weren't the three that Jerry mentioned. It was where the incumbent lived. And the maps that were distributed during the process had a big red star where the incumbents on the maps. They passed out these maps and it had a star of where the incumbent lived. And you could literally look at it and see where you lived, where your potential opponents. I could see where Jerry lived or Bill Tallman lived, the other senators in my neighborhood, and make sure they weren't in my district, that kind of process. So that was number one, not the three things that actually really matter.
Fair Districts for New Mexico is advocating for a fair, transparent, and accountable redistricting process for 2021.